So welcome everyone to our workshop today on identifying outdated research notions. I am so happy to have you all here today. It is so exciting to see such a big crowd of folks. I know we have folks from Ohio State, we have folks from other institutions, we have librarians, we have instructors, we have graduate students. So I think it's going to be a really great audience. Hopefully everyone will find something interesting or helpful in what we're going to be talking about today. So my name is Jane Hammonds. I'm the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian. I'm an assistant professor in the university libraries. You can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu, and I'm happy to talk more about any of this content with you and share resources and materials. So just go ahead and give me an email. We're going to be talking about today is outdated research notions. So we're going to talk about what this might mean, what some examples of outdated research notions might be. Going to think about how we can update some of the guidance or support that we provide for students, and think about some of the strategies and resources that we might have to sort of identify when students have these kinds of misconceptions or are being guided by some of this outdated notions, and how we can help students move beyond them. So outdated research notions. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about outdated research notions? So what I'm meaning with this term is guidance that has often been provided to students, either by instructors, by librarians, or approaches to teaching research or teaching information literacy that are no longer really appropriate or relevant or helpful, especially thinking about how research is actually conducted in the digital age. And in some cases, some of this guidance may even be a little bit harmful in the sense of, it actually might cause students to do worse on certain tasks than they might otherwise, because we're kind of guiding them in the wrong direction. So I want to acknowledge that the theme for this workshop, a lot of the content for this workshop is based on some work that was done by librarians at the University of New Mexico, who created an outdated research notions infographic. Lori Townsend, Glenn Coling, Alyssa Russo, Adrienne Warner. I know Adrienne is here. I'm not sure if anyone else is from that group here, but I want to thank them for their inspiration for today's workshop. I had a chance at a conference this past May to attend a workshop that they gave around outdated research notions. And they were gracious enough to allow me to use their infographic, to use a lot of the content in this workshop. So thank you so much to all of you. And I hope that I do the material justice today. All right. So I want to start and give an example of a potentially outdated research notion. So colleagues at New Mexico, librarians at New Mexico, highlighted one potential outdated research notion is the idea that print sources are more reliable than online sources. And this is guidance that you can find in many places on the internet. I went and just looked up a couple of different places. Yale has this on their Center for Teaching and Learning site, Community College Austin, Western Technical College. These are not the only examples. I just pulled kind of the first ones I found where students are being told that print sources are more reliable than internet sources. And so my first question here is whether or not you agree with this as being an outdated research notion. Do you think that print sources are more reliable or more authoritative than internet sources? And if you don't agree, how would you update that guidance? What would be more relevant to tell students? So I want to pause here and allow folks to have a chance to share any thoughts that they might have about this as being an outdated notion. So if you want to share in the chat, you can feel free to share whether you agree with this or not. And if so, how you might update it. You can also feel free if someone would like to raise their hand and unmute, that is fine as well. So we have some responses coming in. Not necessarily. A lot of journals are only online. Yeah, so that's an excellent point, right? In many cases, print sources don't exist anymore that existed before. So print versions don't exist. Print on demand seems to complicate this. Yes, absolutely. Rebecca shared no sources with editors, peer review process in the publishing are what we were looking for. So Rebecca's arguing that it's really more about the process than the actual format of the source itself. Absolutely. Hannah shared, no, it's just the medium. How you access the source isn't what makes it credible or reliable. Yep, absolutely. The authority of the author is more important than format. Yes. Let's see. May have missed some of the responses come in. Mark shared this might have been true 20 years ago. Yep, absolutely. It depends on the specific sources themselves, right? So it's important to check the credentials. So I think that we're getting some agreement from folks in the chat that it's really not about the media, right? That maybe at one time this may have been advice that was relevant and helpful, but now we know there are so many sources that don't even exist anymore in print. And when they do, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because a source is print that it's more reliable. It's really about the process by which that source was created, the process by which that source was reviewed, right? The content of the source itself, the credibility. So generally seems that we have agreement among folks that we think that this is an outdated research notion. And Mark Short, it's difficult to convince instructors of this, and that's a great point to add in there, Mark. And that's one of the reasons why doing this workshop, thinking about this, inviting librarians, inviting instructors, inviting graduate students to come in. We know that prior knowledge, prior learning continues to impact us, and it can be very hard. Once we have something that we think is true or accurate, it can be very hard to challenge that sort of prior knowledge. So that's a really great point, that we may all agree that this is the case, but there still may be instructors out there, there still may be librarians out there who are providing this guidance. And that's really one of the goals of this workshop, is to kind of shake up some of those things and think about how we might approach things differently. Great. All right, so this is one example that I wanted to share of an outdated research notion. And this was one of the first ones that my friends at New Mexico had highlighted as an example of an outdated research notion. So I wanted to give us a chance to think about, before we jump in, and I'm going to share some more examples myself, I wanted to give you all a chance to think about, what do you think an outdated research notion might be? So something that you were taught that you think is no longer relevant when it comes to research or information literacy, or maybe something you have taught that you no longer teach because you don't think it's relevant anymore. So we're
Hey Jane, your audio cut out.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Kat did that again, of course. So again, the easiest way I think to add a note is to go over here on the left-hand side, click sticky note, and that will allow you to type your response in there. So we'll give everyone a chance. What is something that you think is an outdated research notion that you taught before or was taught to you, and that is still sometimes taught, but you think should no longer be taught? Again, feel free to add your responses. So try to get this cat out of the way so he doesn't mute me one more time. So I always laugh and think there's a comic of someone trying to give a Zoom meeting, and in the background you can see their cat duct taped to the wall. Like that's the only way to be able to give a Zoom meeting with the cat. All right, so we'll give everyone a few more seconds. Some of the responses that we see coming in, we see several folks pointing to the idea of using domain as a way to determine whether a source is good or bad, which we're going to talk about a little bit in a second. So yeah, I think that is definitely one. The CRAP test someone has mentioned, we're going to talk about that one. Better book than article. Yeah. So thinking that, one type of source, one format is better than another. Absolutely. Someone mentioned the internet is a bad place to find sources. Yep, absolutely. Never use Wikipedia. That is definitely guidance that has been given quite a bit. Absolutely. Let's see others. That peer review always means quality. And many articles are retracted annually, even from peer-reviewed sources. Absolutely. You're going to talk more about that one. Weak heuristics like domain, appearance. Yep, absolutely. If a website looks professional, free of typos, it's more than likely credible. Yeah. So lots of stuff about source evaluation and some of the guidance that we've given students over the years about how to identify whether or not a source is credible or not. Some guidance in here about where to go to find sources, and that there's certain places or certain formats of sources that are more appropriate than others. Someone had mentioned that you have to possess a PhD to produce credible research. I think that's a really great one. Thinking about whose voices we consider to be more credible and why or why not. Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Thank you all for adding those. Absolutely. So many of these we're going to talk about, and then we'll talk about a few others that are not listed on here, and we'll see if you all agree if these are also outdated notions. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our presentation here. All right, so hopefully everyone is seeing the slides. If you're not seeing the slides again, just let me know. So the notions that I'm going to highlight, some, as I mentioned, folks have already talked about domain, about checklist approach, talk a little bit about plagiarism, starting with the thesis statement and peer review credibility. And again, not everyone may agree with all of these. And if you don't, that's okay. Some of them may be a little bit controversial. But the idea is just to get us thinking about the kinds of guidance that we've traditionally given to students around research and information literacy, and whether all of that continues to be relevant or appropriate or helpful. All right, so lots of folks mentioned domain. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but students have gotten a lot of guidance over the years that looking at the domain is a way to determine whether or not a source is credible, right? If it's a .org, it's supposed to be a nonprofit organization and credible. If it's a .com, you shouldn't use it, right? And this guidance has really, been something that from my experience, a lot of students have latched onto as something that, they really talk about and really think about. And, there's been research looking at this as well. So Weinberg and some of his colleagues have looked at students' evaluation processes and found that this guidance has really sunk in with a lot of students, right? They go right away to this idea that if it's a .org, that means I can trust it. If it's a .com, that means I should avoid it, right? So they really kind of focus in on this as a key aspect in thinking about the credibility of information sources. So what is the problem with providing this as guidance to students? The problem is that it just really is not accurate, right? When we think about .org sources, anyone can get a .org source. There's absolutely no requirement that you be a nonprofit organization. An individual, go online, pay a few dollars, you've got your .org site, right? Companies, for-profit industries, lobbying organizations, all of those can get .org sites. Even if it is a nonprofit organization, that does not automatically ensure credibility, right? And then there's the challenge with students completely avoiding .com sites, right? Even though that we know most of the reputable news sites are going to be .com sites. We know that the homepage for most academic journals is .com, right? So as the quote indicates, just saying that I can't trust any source that's a .com, leaves students without a lot of options in terms of finding news. It leaves options in terms of finding scholarly articles through the internet, although they could, of course, find them through databases. And I think that this guidance, the examples that I've seen often ignores non-US domains entirely. So a student might see like a .uk at the end and might not be sure what that is at all, and so kind of avoid that site as well. So for me, I think that this, and I think it was echoed in the responses that we saw at the Jamboard, is something that we really need to let go of. This idea that we need to teach students about using the domain as a way to determine whether or not a source is credible. Right. So that's the first outdated notion that is very closely connected to this second one. This is sort of part of the same one. is vertical source evaluation guidance. So checklist approach guidance, such as the CRAP test, as someone mentioned in their comment, right? If you're not familiar with the CRAP test, this is a sort of checklist to evaluating sources that encourages students to look at 5 factors: credibility, currency, relevance. I knew I was going to forget this: currency, relevance, purpose, accuracy, and authority. Right? Which on the surface doesn't sound like a bad thing to look at, right? But a lot of this guidance really encourages students to focus on superficial factors of the site and really to trust what the site says about itself. So it'll have, a checklist of 25 or 30 things that students are supposed to go down and, look at. And does the site look professional? Does it have any typos? Do they have links? Do they have references? Trusting the about us section. What do they say about themselves? How do they describe themselves? How do they describe their purpose? Right. So it encourages students to stay on the site and to use the site itself to determine the credibility of the site and what the site tells you about itself. What is the challenge of this kind of approach, right? We know that the CRAP test and similar kind of checklist approach were really developed very early in the early days of the internet, when it was much more challenging for people to be able to create websites, and that we progressed in terms of how sites are connected to each other, how sites are created, that guidance just really is not very helpful anymore. The study Educating for Misunderstanding looked at students' use of this and found that students gave a lot of special focus on the About Us page. They really trusted what those sites said and didn't recognize that there's no one telling an organization that they have to be truthful when they describe themselves, right? Whatever organization has created that site, they can say whatever they want about how, what the purpose of their organization is, right? So they can spin it however they want. No one is checking to say whether or not these groups are being truthful when they are describing themselves on their About Us page. Links and references, same kind of thing, right? Folks who design websites know that if they put links to sources that seem to be credible, that's going to enhance the appearance of credibility for their site, right? Even if those links actually don't support what they're saying, right? So I know if I'm going to put a couple links to the New York Times on here, people are going to think, oh, okay, look what they're talking about. And that New York Times article might actually contradict what they're saying, but they know folks aren't going to actually go out and read most of those articles. And then appearance, right? At one point in time, yeah, it was challenging to create a really great professional looking website. Is that the case anymore? No. It's really easy to create a great professional looking website. And folks know that, and they know the better their site looks, the more professional it looks, that it's going to look more trustworthy. Right. So again, this is my second example of outdated research notions. And a lot of folks mention this again as well in their comments on the Jamboard as being outdated. So the third one that I want to talk about, this one might be for some folks maybe a little bit more controversial. And this is the idea that we teach that plagiarism is theft, or we talk about plagiarism as a crime, or as students as being criminals, right? When we talk about plagiarism. And these are some examples. I looked plagiarism. I went into Adobe Stock and said, what images pop up when you look for plagiarism? And you can see the sort of prevalence of this notion, right? Here's the thief running away with someone else's idea, running away with someone else's property, right? And you can find a lot of examples of this. I just went out yesterday and was looking at a couple videos, and videos titled "Plagiarism is Stealing," right? Plagiarism is theft. On all kinds of organizations, all kinds of websites for all kinds of institutions have this language of plagiarism as theft. So what might be outdated or problematic about taking this approach? First of all, it's generally technically not really accurate in the sense that in most cases plagiarism is not actually a crime. And it can get tricky when it comes to like fraud or copyright infringement, those kinds of things. But in general, sort of academic plagiarism is not a crime. But it is an ethical violation. I'm not denying that. But from my perspective, when we frame plagiarism as theft or as crime, we are, putting our students in the position of being criminals and we then have to be the plagiarism police, right? And so that sets up a very, for me, a very negative dynamic, where, we are looking at our students as being criminals, and our job is to police them. Our job is to punish them, right, for plagiarism. And I think that this contributes to this overall broader sort of anxiety that everyone has around plagiarism. And you can see examples where, students who, I'm absolutely sure that I'm not plagiarized, but I'm so worried anyway that I'm going to get accused of plagiarism, because we've created this environment where when we talk about plagiarism, we talk about it in this very negative way often. And I think that especially as we're moving into this era of artificial intelligence, and it becomes even more tricky when we start to talk about thinking about plagiarism as theft of someone else's ideas. So some folks have already heard me mention this. If you've been in one of my previous workshops, I talked about this the last couple of weeks. Ohio State's policy description of plagiarism talks about, taking another person's ideas. And I can very easily see how a student would look at that definition and say, AI is not a person, and so I'm not committing plagiarism, right? So, I think our definitions, our understanding of plagiarism, are becoming more complicated as we have, the growth of AI tools and those kinds of things. So, I argue against this idea that we should have this understanding of plagiarism as being theft. Everyone may not agree with me. That's okay. But just wanted to highlight that as another example. And by the way, I'm going to plan, after I go through the examples I'm going to share some updated notions. So keep that in mind as we go forward. The next one I want to mention is this idea, and the librarians at New Mexico also highlighted this as one that they consider to be an outdated notion as well. This idea that research should start with a thesis statement. And this is guidance that students get a lot. You can find this on all kinds of websites out there. First part of the research process should be developing your thesis statement. So what is the problem with this approach, right? First of all, it kind of contributes to this idea that research is a very step-by-step linear process. I have my thesis statement. I'm going to go out and find sources that only support that statement. And that's sort of the goal of research, right? So it cuts off really any sort of open-ended engagement or inquiry about a particular topic or question, right? Because the idea is already in mind of what I'm going to find, and I'm going to go out and find that information, right? Whereas, if we think about research as starting with inquiry, right, as starting with questions, right? Unsettled questions that haven't been answered in our field, in our discipline, right? And then that's much more open approach, right? Because we don't know, we're not setting out with something in, mind that we think that we're automatically going to find or prove. Right? So that's another example of an outdated research notion. And then the last one I wanted to highlight really quickly, and several folks mentioned this one as well on the Jamboard, is this idea that we should automatically consider scholarly or peer review sources to be the most authoritative sources or to be the best sources, right? And you can find examples of this guidance. And so at the University of Illinois, for example, site, they have, talking about peer-reviewed sources, you can be certain that experts in the relevant field have read it and, independent of their own particular opinions, verified it to meet a high standard of scholarship. Well, when we are providing students with guidance like that, and apologies for any folks that are from the University of Illinois, that's actually where I went to grad school. So I don't hate Illinois. I love Illinois. But when I saw this guidance, I was like, what are we telling students when we tell students this? Do they have to do anything else with that article at all? Do they have to do any evaluation of their own? Because we've told them they can be certain that this is good scholarship because it has been through the peer review process. So what is the problem with this, right? Folks mentioned in the Jamboard, significant concerns have been raised around the peer review process, around the, whether or not it is truly impartial, transparent. I'm going to talk more about this later. We know that peer-reviewed sources can be retracted later on. It happens fairly frequently. You can go to the Retraction Watch website and find all kinds of examples of peer-reviewed articles that have been retracted later on. And then we also know that just depending on the context, peer review sources just may not either be available or they may not be the most appropriate types of sources, in terms of thinking about current events, how long it takes the peer review process to happen, right? If students are looking for certain types of information or certain types of sources, peer review is not going to be always the most appropriate type of source. All right, so those are the examples that I wanted to highlight. There are definitely others out there. We're going to talk about a few more a little bit later on. But I wanted to pause there to see, first of all, if you disagree with any of those, or if you have concerns about any of those, or if there's any that you just want to discuss in more depth. You can feel free to add your response to the chat. I see we have a few comments in there. Or just if you have any questions. So I'll take a look at the chat. Again, feel free to add any comments that you have. If you want to raise your hand and unmute, you can feel free to do that as well. So some of the comments coming in. It's another one that seems to be difficult to convince students of. I think maybe Lynn, you're probably talking about the .org one, definitely. So Kimberly should, I almost trust websites more now if they're not slick and modern. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Confirmation bias. Yeah. So we know that we're going to find the sources that reflect the thesis that we've already developed. Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts, questions, comments that folks have around any of the outdated notions that I've highlighted. So Ralph shared, replication crises in some fields should serve as further caution against blind trust in peer review. Absolutely, right? One study gets published and maybe the study was accurate, maybe it was, but we can't repeat it. We can't get those same results again. But by that time, that first study has already been taken by gospel as so many people that, right. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for raising that point. Mm-hmm. So we'll give it 30 more seconds to see if other questions, comments that folks have about any of those outdated notions. And then we're going to think about, what are the alternate approaches that we might want to think about with some of these. So what are the updated notions? We'll pause here. I am concerned about the peer review. It is still required. So yeah, that's a great point, Magda. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. I'm not advocating that we say that peer review has no value, because I don't think that is the case. But I am advocating that we complicate a little bit the message that we provide about peer review so that we don't tell students that peer review automatically means something should be considered credible and trustworthy. And then they no longer have to do any evaluation of that content themselves. Giving students this idea that if they can't find peer-reviewed sources on a particular topic, that means that topic is not worthy of study. So again, yeah, I definitely don't want, I'm not suggesting that we completely toss out peer review, but I am suggesting that we be more nuanced in how we talk about peer review with students. Let's see. And Adrian shared, and the evidence that abstracts are not really objective and tend to paint the research in a more positive light than the rest of the article may exhibit. Yes, absolutely. Right. The abstract presents one picture, but when you really dig into the data, is that actually what it's saying? Yeah, absolutely. Another reason why it's important that we make sure that students realize that they need to actually do some evaluation of the source beyond just saying, okay, it's been published as peer review. That means it's good. Mm-hmm. All right. So what are some of the updated notions? So thinking about source evaluation and thinking about the idea of using domain, thinking about using appearance and using the about us, checklist approach to evaluation. The alternate approach that I am recommending and that many other folks recommend now as well, moving away from the crap test, moving away from checklists, and really highlighting this idea of lateral reading. And if you're not familiar with lateral reading, this is an approach that encourages students to actually spend very little time, initially at least, on a site that they are evaluating, that, instead go out and find out what, other people have said about that site. So open multiple tabs, Do a Wikipedia search. What can you find out about that organization that sponsored that site using Wikipedia? What can you find out about the author using Wikipedia? Do a Google search. See if other folks have talked about that organization, about that website, about the people that are mentioned there, about the claims that are being made on that site, right? So if the site says, everyone needs to drink, 5 gallons of milk a day to be healthy, find other sources, search for that claim and see if you can find other sources that support that particular claim. So it's really about, instead of doing that sort of vertical reading where you stay on the one site, it's about going out and seeing what everyone else says about this site, seeing what other information that you can find out there. So going out lateral and doing fact checking. And there's some evidence studies that have been done around lateral reading that found that folks that use this method tend to be more accurate in their evaluation of sources, right? Because they're not just relying on what the source tells you about itself, but they are getting additional context and additional confirmation from other sources about that source. Right, so that's the lateral reading approach, going out and searching across multiple sites to evaluate the credibility of a site or a creator or the claims of that particular site. So if you're interested in teaching more about lateral reading, here's a great video from the University of Louisville Libraries. And I put together multiple resources on using the lateral reading method. There's an online guide that I've created. There's a handout, lateral reading, that University of Louisville has created. There's great videos out there on lateral reading. If you're at Ohio State, we also have a Carmen Canvas module on evaluating sources using lateral reading that you can download into your Carmen course. And it takes students through the lateral reading process and gives them guidance on that. So lots of resources out there on lateral reading. So again, this is one alternate approach that we recommend in place of focusing on domain, in place of focusing on checklist approach to evaluating sources. Let's see, we had a couple comments coming in. So let's see, we have Mark Short. I think it's challenging for first year students to deal with nuance and messy research process. They want good grade and black and white rules. Absolutely. The messiness does make it more difficult for students to grasp and more difficult for librarians to teach, as Jennifer shared. I completely agree. It is definitely more challenging. And, especially for librarians who may only have 50 minutes with a student, it's difficult. But if we stick with the methods, the CRAP test or appearance, those kinds of easy kind of checklist things, we could in the end actually be doing more harm and causing students to trust sites that are in a way that they would not have otherwise. So don't want to downplay the fact that this is not, this does make it easier as we complicate it does make it harder, as we complicate these issues. Absolutely. All right, so lateral reading. Thinking about teaching plagiarism as theft or plagiarism as a crime. I really support taking a much more empathetic approach to teaching about plagiarism, avoiding referring to plagiarism as a crime or as a moral failing, and really trying to acknowledge the complexities related to plagiarism. We sometimes, I think, present it as a very black and white issue, and it's really not. It can be very confusing to identify what is actually plagiarism and what is not. And I think the growth of AI tools is making that even more complicated. What is an appropriate use of AI tools when it comes to plagiarism? There's a graphic that I've showed in previous workshops that has is it plagiarism? It's this incredibly complex graph, but there's 13 different types of plagiarism that might exist, right? And I didn't include that here, but it's not as simple as we sometimes make it out to be to determine what is plagiarism and what is not. And so really acknowledging the complexities when we talk about plagiarism, when we talk about citations, really highlighting the value that citations have, for example, in helping us understand and follow and engage with the scholarly conversations on our topic. Being as transparent as possible about our expectations. One of the things that I like to do, I have a sample assignment here linked for those folks that are interested is, I did an assignment several times previously in the past with students where I'd let them just tell me their concerns and their anxieties and how they felt about plagiarism and anxiety. And I got really strong responses. Students had very strong emotional responses to these topics. So that gave it a chance to let them share their feelings and their concerns and their worries. And then we could talk about them. Right. So, acknowledging that this is a fraught issue and that students are going to have a lot of concerns around it. And if possible, you're in a situation, thinking about allowing for more functional citations in certain situations. Is it always necessary that students have perfect APA citation for every source? Or is it okay for certain assignments for them just to put the name and a link? Obviously occasionally links no longer work, but I think, it used to be much more common that if all you had was a link that you would, go to a site. For me, I think it's a little less common now. And so maybe it's fine if it really is just, for this assignment, it's fine to just do a name and a link. So if you're interested in thinking about more of that, Ohio State has a great positive approach to academic integrity guide on their Teaching and Learning Resource Center. I have a link here to a presentation, Under Pressure, Rethinking How We Teach Plagiarism. This was by a couple of librarians at the ACRL conference a couple of years ago that really helped change my thinking about how we teach plagiarism. So I highly recommend that if you have a chance to take a look at that, and just have some teaching resources there related to plagiarism. I do want to mention here that I know, if you're in the instructor role, you may have at your institution specific guidance about how you are supposed to deal with plagiarism, and that you are required to report any suspected cases of plagiarism. And I don't want folks to feel that I'm encouraging them to go against what their policy is. If you have a policy where the goal is to automatically report any suspected cases of plagiarism, and then I understand. If you are in a situation in a context where you feel personally comfortable taking more of an empathetic approach to plagiarism, that is what I'm recommending, but I know that may not be possible in all cases. And I want to say I completely understand that. Let's see. Comment coming in about the difficulty, if I can move up. Just because it's more difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't make these adjustments to the way we teach. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Absolutely. All right. So more updated guidance, thinking about, starting research with a thesis statement. Instead, thinking about research, and this is, of course, librarians will be familiar with the framework for information literacy, teaching research as a process of an open-ended inquiry, right? Encouraging students to start with questions rather than a thesis statement, and really talking about and emphasizing research as a collaborative and ongoing process that is about contributing to a scholarly or professional or public conversation on a topic, rather than just research as a process of finding information that supports the idea that I already had. Right? It's more about looking at the multiple perspectives that are out there, having and using, thinking about how the sources can guide our own thinking on a topic. Right? So just being more open, engaging with the information that we find, rather than discarding something just because it doesn't match the thesis statement that we had already set out for ourselves. So interested in teaching more about research as inquiry, I have a lot of resources here: online guides, graphics, recorded workshops, all of those, some activities so available. We also do have a Carmen Canvas module for Ohio State folks on understanding of research as inquiry that is aimed at students. You can download that into your course and have that available as well. And then going back to the question that Magda had asked about peer review and how we might teach this. And so, this is my recommendation in terms of thinking about how we approach peer review, that we emphasize that, yes, it is a valuable process, but we talk with students, frankly, about the challenges associated with the peer review system. Right? We highlight the benefits that come from this, but we highlight the concerns that have been raised. We know that there's potential out there in terms of bias, inconsistency. There's been studies that, an article will be submitted, it will be approved, it will be submitted again, and it will be rejected. Right, with only minor changes. And it's just the inconsistency of who was selected as the peer reviewers at that time. There's been some folks that have argued, that peer review creates sort of a barrier against novelty, because any sort of really new approaches or new ideas are more likely to get rejected as part of the peer review process. So it sort of tends to go with the established knowledge in certain cases. Concerns about, the exploitation of reviewers. We know most peer reviewers are not getting paid for their work, right? But it can be a substantial amount of time, right? And then we already talked about the issue of retractions as well. So, really emphasizing for students that peer review can be, a valuable first sort of step and, initial kind of step as part of the evaluation process. But that doesn't, mean that they don't need to do any additional thinking or evaluation of that particular source. And also, again, highlighting the idea that in certain contexts, in certain situations, peer-reviewed sources may not exist or may not be the most appropriate sources. So I've got some different sources here. I did want to highlight the California State University Dominguez Hills has a LibGuide and a video about the peer review process that I really liked, because it was one of the ones that I thought that actually did present a really good nuanced view of the peer review process and really highlighted some of the concerns that were raised. So if you're interested in a video to get started with a discussion on that topic with your students, I would recommend taking a look at that video. And then again, highlighting this idea of authority being constructed and contextual. So instead of this idea that peer-reviewed sources are always going to be the gold standard or always going to be the most appropriate sources to use, emphasizing this idea that, authority can come in many different ways. And depending on the context, certain types of sources might be more authoritative. Someone had mentioned on the Jamboard that you have to have a PhD to produce credible research, right? And I think this really gets to that idea that there are voices out there that can be very important voices on the topics that we are looking at that we are ignoring because they don't have a PhD and they're not publishing in peer-reviewed journals, right? So, opening it up to students, the recognition that, there can be really great, valuable, useful sources out there beyond the peer-reviewed sources. All right. So that was the updated notions and outdated updated notions. So I'll pause here to see if we have any questions, comments before we move into the last part of the workshop. We'll just be a few examples of some activities that we might be able to do to kind of, again, help students think through some of these issues. So I'll pause here to see if there are any questions or comments. Okay, so we'll go ahead. And I thought we might do a really quick activity. I was going to do this on the Jamboard, but I don't know, in the interest of time, if we have time to do that. So here are a few examples of additional outdated notions, or potentially outdated notions. One, Wikipedia is bad, which is also one that was highlighted by librarians at the University of New Mexico. Another potential one is Google Scholar is bad. One is search engines are neutral. And one is unbiased sources exist. So why don't you take a minute and take a look at any of those and see if there are any one of those that you think is a really important outdated notion that we need to address. And if so, what guidance that you might think about sharing instead. So if you totally believe and agree that Wikipedia is bad, what is the updated guidance that you would share? If you, totally agree that unbiased sources existing is, bad guidance, how would you update that guidance? So give folks a chance to share, which of these that you think is really relevant as an outdated notion, and what new guidance that you might provide. If there are any of these that you don't consider to be outdated or you have questions about, feel free to add those as well. I wanted to share these as additional potential examples, but they may not everyone may agree with them. So see some comments that came in the chat. So in thinking about Wikipedia is bad, Lennon shared, Wikipedia may be a great way to locate additional, more authoritative sources by following the citations. Yes, right? So acknowledging, that Wikipedia can be an appropriate part of the research process. We can use Wikipedia as a great place to, do citation tracing. Yes, absolutely. Kimberly shared, Wikipedia is a good place to get introductory information on an unfamiliar topic. It may not be an acceptable citation in your paper, but you should look at the citation Wikipedia uses and start your research there. Yes. And I think that makes a great point, Kimberly, is that a lot of times we are asking our students to research topics that they don't really know much about. And so they need that background information in a digestible format like a Wikipedia, sometimes before you can even develop a research question, right? I would tell students to go to Wikipedia first, because that's going to give you an idea of what folks have been talking about related to this concept that can even allow you to develop a research question. So, we have to remember that students just often don't have the same amount of background knowledge on a topic that we do. So using a source like Wikipedia can be really helpful, right? And as folks have mentioned, can be really valuable in helping students find additional sources as well. For Google Scholar, Carrie shared, Google Scholar and setting Google Scholar alerts can be a great way to find some recently published research articles to supplement your database searches. Yes, absolutely, Carrie. So not telling students that Google Scholar should be the only source that they go to for information, but incorporating Google Scholar as part of the research process, getting updates, recently published articles. Absolutely. I use Google Scholar all the time to find additional citations. Let's see. So to statement D, that unbiased sources exist. Sandra shared, I agree, D is important to get rid of. It is much more important to acknowledge the bias and how it will affect the research. Yes, completely agree with that. And this is one of the ones, right, this idea that we tell students that they should go out and find a source that's completely objective, right? But do any completely objective sources exist? Even peer-reviewed, scholarly, credible articles will have some sort of bias. Because of the questions that the scholars chose to ask or the sources that they chose to use. Absolutely. So thinking about how the bias would exist and how it might affect the research. Google Scholar isn't bad, but it needs to be used more strategically than how it is often used. Absolutely, completely agree. Yes, absolutely, Shruk. Sometimes theoretical tests may be a little dense, difficult, and Wikipedia offers a summary that is more accessible. I completely agree. Absolutely. Jennifer shared, all sources have a certain degree of bias, so good researchers include multiple sources with different points of view. Absolutely. Google Scholar as a helpful school tool, good. Yeah, absolutely. Cheryl, I tell life science students to ask their prof about Google Scholar. Yeah, and so it's not Cheryl, right? It's not necessarily that everything that they find in Google Scholar is going to be great. But I think completely cutting off Google Scholar as a research tool, is similar to completely cutting off Wikipedia as a research tool. No, Wikipedia should not be the only source. No, Google Scholar should not be the only search tool. But using these as part of the search process, I think is, relevant and a valid approach. Absolutely. Good location to learn about jargon. Absolutely. Further explore the main ideas. Absolutely, Megan. So thank you all so much for sharing these, right? So these are some great examples of ways that maybe we need to complicate or be a little bit more nuanced in some of the guidance that we may share with students. And I think that it's especially something like Wikipedia being bad, a lot of folks have moved beyond that, but not everyone, maybe not everyone. Students may still be getting that guidance from folks. But things like unbiased sources still exist. You still see guidance out there that you need to, find the objective source, those kinds of things. So yeah, thank you all. So these are just a few examples of some additional outdated notions and how we might update them. Any questions on any of those before I share really quickly some just quick ideas about teaching activities and notions? Teaching activities. All right, so really quickly, so one of the things that you might wonder is, how do I know, what outdated notions students actually have? I want to be able to address the misconceptions or misunderstandings that students might have, but I don't know exactly what they are. So there are a lot of different, I think, fairly quick activities that you can do to get some idea of what might be guiding students sort of search or evaluation processes. I use true false activities a lot. Give them statements about, examples of the ones that we did. Peer-reviewed sources should always be considered credible, and have them tell you whether or not they're true or false. Brainstorming activities. I used to do this a lot with source evaluation. I would have students just say, okay, I would go up to the whiteboard and say, tell me all of the things that you use to evaluate sources. And they would automatically start with .com and .org. and how it looks. And so I would put them all on the board and then talk about them sort of one by one as what might be problematic with this as an example. Self-explaining activities, lots of ways that you can do this, but having students tell you their process, right? What process would you use to evaluate this source? In some classes that we teach, we have students do a screencast of themselves doing a search. And they describe their search and evaluation process. And this is where we also still get, okay, I would trust this source because it's a .org. And so they tell us what they're thinking about that source, and that allows us to directly address some of those misconceptions. Or you can give students various examples of scenarios. This is what the student did in this particular situation. Do you think, that was the appropriate way to go about this topic? So, a lot of these activities don't take a lot of time, but can give you a better understanding of any of those misconceptions that students might have that might still be influencing their research process. So again, and this is sort of based on what we did, but, doing sort of a version of this workshop with students themselves, provide them with a list of, here are some potentially outdated research notions. Assign each group one of these to go and actually research and investigate. What did you find out about whether or not this is still true or whether or not this is still accurate? And have those students provide and share their updated notions. So as I mentioned, librarians in New Mexico created a really great infographic around outdated research notions. Students could create their own version, based on the notions that you had talked about and found in your class. So that could be a fun activity to do with students. And one of the things that that you might be able to do is find a video that highlights an outdated notion. So I mentioned one, for example, that I found yesterday that was that plagiarism is stealing was like the title, and have students rewrite the script. Right. And I used to do this with a similar kind of concept with a video Cookie Monster in the library. And I would have students write an updated script to this Cookie Monster in the library video. And students loved this assignment. Right. They found it fun. It was, and they got to talk about, because the video really highlights libraries are all about books. Right. And okay, how would you update this for the modern era? So you could do a version of this kind of assignment, finding a video, finding a LibGuide, finding guidance out there that gives students, outdated information and have them update that information themselves. So those are a few examples. So we coming to the end of our time. Wanted to see if you all have any ideas on sort of key takeaways from this workshop, action steps that you would like to take going forward, any additional questions, comments, thoughts that you have. Finding an outdated video and updating it sounds like a really fun exercise for any subject. Yeah, I completely agree. I did the Cookie Monster one just because it was fun, but students really liked it. And so I think it's a great fun activity that you can do with students. Mark said, interested in the idea of empathetic approach to plagiarism. Yeah, great, Mark. That's one of the things that I really shifted my thinking a lot in the last couple of years. And I do recommend taking a look at that Under Pressure video that I had linked there. It was one that really started to kind of turn my thinking around on this topic. Absolutely. Action step, create more interactive assignments about referencing, which utilize students' input. But great, Lori. Yeah. And if you do, I would love to see what those assignments look like. So feel free to let me know. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Judy. Thanks. Like the emphasis on research is an open-ended and part of an always ongoing process of inquiry. Yes, Ralph, absolutely. I think that's really key, is that we really start to take that approach as research is being guided by inquiry. Jua, I have to change my plagiarism lesson plan. Thank you so much for the great ideas. Wonderful. Yeah, and if you do make any changes to anything, I would love to hear about it. So please feel free to share that.